The starting point for this paper is a question that has generated a lot of Kierkegaard scholarship over the past several decades. Is the ethical existence sphere an improvement over the aesthetic? If so, how can we understand it? Are we happier when we lead ethical lives? Does the ethical satisfy some general human interests better than the aesthetic? Is the ethical more rationally or internally consistent? These are some of the directions we could go, but I think there are still some underexplored ways to approach the debate. Obviously, either or is the central text for this debate. And so much of the focus throughout the years has been on Judge Williams' second letter. But he did write a first letter, which is all about marriage and how being married is better than being single. When we take the perspective of the marriage letter in this debate, I think we get a different answer for how ethical life could be superior to aesthetic. Williams seems to have a different set of issues and texts in mind when first responding to the aesthetic. The most important of these issues, I shall argue, is the problem of boredom. A's essay on the rotation of crops is the most famous example, but Seducer's Diary and even Repetition also take boredom to be an existential problem that demands sophisticated, intentional effort to fend off. The purpose of my talk today then will be to evaluate Williams' response to boredom. Oddly, given its priority as a problem for aesthetic life, his references to it are scattered and indirect. So part of my work today will be to piece together how I think William ought to respond based on the content of his marriage letter. And I should say, William is often dense, obscure, and convoluted all at once. So I will do my best to construct what I think his argument ought to be. Central to his argument is the idea that erotic love reaches its fulfillment in marriage. So my paper will begin by describing how the aesthetic writings describe the relationship between erotic love and boredom. Given this problem, I discuss options William could take in response, ultimately leading to his account of marriage as an historical institution that fulfills erotic love. I will conclude the paper with some thoughts on how convincing William's case is to A, as well as to us contemporary readers. I appreciate William's perspective on how marriage is different from other relationships, but I have doubts that he convincingly answers the problem that A sets up. And if I could just add one other personal note. I've been married for over 10 years, and every so often, I wonder how my married life is an improvement from my single bachelorhood days. As Kierkegaard scholars, we are used to hearing that Kierkegaard is the one philosopher whose ideas are supposed to make a difference on how life is actually lived. So it's in this spirit that I'm invested in this debate. William is telling the reader why it's important for us to be married. So what genuinely matters to me, and everyone really, to know whether or not he's right. So beginning with the appeal of the erotic to the aesthetic. Both aesthetic and ethical life take the experience of erotic love as a basic reference point for their respective texts. Both agree on the importance of this experience for human life in general, but erotic love matters to their respective views on life for different reasons. When it comes to understanding A's perspective on love, I actually think William has a good insight. A's fascination with erotic love centers on the initial experience of falling in love with another person, that is, first love. Sharon Krishek has very helpfully explained, to me at least, that the first love should not be understood as the first time one actually falls in love, but rather that initial heady phase when love first blooms in a romantic relationship. So the main appeal of erotic love has to do with experience of first love. It's a time many of us fondly remember, being overcome by an experience so beautiful, one lacks a language or logic to explain the experience to oneself or to others. First love's nature is elusive. It makes sense to describe it as not wanting to be limited by any of our attempts to define it, almost as if it possessed an agency itself, as William, I think, will kind of build off of. Both the aesthetic and the ethical writings tend to describe erotic love's ultimate nature in terms of categories that exhaust our everyday descriptions. Whereas A claims that erotic love desires infinity, William claims such love desires eternity. In addition, William explains that first love is complete. It justifies its own existence. When one finds oneself within its domain, one doesn't have any other intention or desire for life. There's nothing else that one needs. In this respect, then, first love appears to free us from the practical need to maintain intentional control over life. All we do is just let ourselves be swept along in the experience and ride it out for as long as we possibly can. William calls this feeling of being pulled the telos of first love. More on that later. Understood in this way, first love is a logical fit for A, given the other things we know of his personality. From the Diapsalmata, we know that A is unimpressed by the advice that friends like William have tried to provide. At times, A seems to anticipate Camus when pointing out how marriage and the busybody bourgeois life in general fail to overcome the absurdity that lies at the core of human existence. There's no deeper lasting meaning to be gained by taking up William's advice. Moreover, A doesn't seem able to take intentional control over his life in a way that would initiate the serious change that William thinks he needs. To the contrary, he voices explicit frustration and lack of confidence over his ability to have a direct, meaningful impact on his life direction. He can't do the things he wants to, feeling instead like a chess piece that may not be moved. Therefore, given how A finds himself lacking the ability to affect real changes in the world, it is easy to see the appeal of erotic love, or first love. Erotic experience is a coping mechanism, in a way. A can simply let it pull him along without having to confront questions about deep meaning or the need to take direct control over his life. What should we make of his perspective at this point? Romantic melodrama? I think it's more accurate to think that A has a tragic view of life, as many people have argued, wherein greater external forces shape major life events and render individuals unable to do much of anything to change its direction significantly. And surely this is a defensible position. For this reason, then, it's important to acknowledge A's aestheticism as a plausible enough form of life that we cannot dismiss outright as either conceptually or practically unsustainable. It's worth keeping in mind that A appears to be a functioning member of society. He's not some institutionalized schizophrenic. He's a serious enough person whom William thinks can ultimately be brought around to make a major change in his life, so long as he is given the right kind of explanation. There's a further development within the aesthetic life, however, that refocuses our understanding of A's existential predicament. In the Rotation of Crops essay, we learn from A that a basic problem in life is boredom. Aside from some of its tongue-in-cheek remarks, the essay makes a serious point. As an empirical matter, nobody really likes being bored. To describe boredom in everyday terms is easy. You find yourself bored because your conscious awareness gives you nothing that is worth doing. Nothing is important. At a deeper level, the attitude of boredom presupposes a reflective intellectual faculty capable of making specific value judgments. Boredom, therefore, represents a practical structural problem in that conscious awareness cannot identify with anything that is given to it immediately in experience. Boredom indicates the formal gap between the individual and their desire to engage with objects in the world. The given immediate objects of experience don't make any practical claim upon an individual. Thus, A observes boredom is, quote, built upon emptiness. Boredom rests upon the nothingness that interlaces existence. Its dizziness is infinite, like that which comes from looking down into a bottomless abyss. Boredom is like nihilism. For boredom to register as a more serious existential problem, however, I contend that the agent must also have an awareness of her own temporal finitude. Time passes with or without our readiness to identify with the objects given immediately in our experience. Most human beings are able to be bored, but it only becomes an existential problem when one recognizes the existential threat of human finitude. We only have so much time in our day-to-day life to accomplish what we need to. And I think this fits with our basic intuitions. If we were to stop and consider boredom as a phenomenon, I think we'd only feel the urgency to confront it if we feel the need to do something else with our time. Ace himself seems to suggest that boredom ceases being a problem if one could transport oneself beyond the temporal domain of life altogether. Aside from whatever techniques could facilitate such temporal escape, A's general counsel is more down to earth, focusing on the reflective power to reassign value to objects, activities, and experiences whenever boredom arises. That is, the solution to boredom lies in the creative manipulation of our given objects of experience such that they are able to re-engage us again. A is simply telling us to rotate between new and novel perspectives on life in order to keep it interesting. This emphasis on the interesting prioritizes the creative power of the individual. It's up to the individual, him or herself, to bring out the contrast between different circumstances, either in one's mind or real life. There's going to be some debate over how constrained an individual is or ought to be in their exercise of these intellectual powers, and William also weighs in on the issues I'll show. A's advice extends to every facet of our life, in particular our relationships with others. We should never settle down in friendships, careers, or any personal commitments that might impair our capacity to rotate perspective when things get boring. For this reason, we should especially avoid marriage. Marriage ties a person down, as they say. Marriage involves certain duties towards a spouse that seemingly forbid treating him or her like an object to be played around with to make more interesting. Again, more on that later. Moreover, the extensive practical reality of marital obligation seems to make marriage the opposite of the interesting, so long as the interesting means keeping a consistently novel perspective. Marriage, rather, has to dwell within the same person, same routine, same everything. Hence, A advises us to break off romance should it ever become so serious it could turn into marriage. So let me try to draw all these observations together. A's fascination is with erotic love, first love, and his fascination lay in the fact that it provides a complete self-sufficient experience, which further relieves him of the need to assert direct volitional control over his life. Erotic love takes off some of the pressure to be creative, but we must also resist this feeling from ever leading us to marriage, as a long-term relationship risks turning into a life of continual boredom. So in the end, A's problem is with boredom, and erotic love is a technique of diversion. But could there be another way to think about the issues, how the issues generate the problem? That's a sort of rhetorical question that William poses to his aesthete friend. So, ethical perspective on erotic love. As mentioned at the beginning, there has been some debate over the idea that ethical life marks an improvement over aesthetic life. Arguably, the very title of William's first letter, The Aesthetic Validity of Marriage, suggests this to some extent. A standard reading of this letter is that it aims to show A, how marriage fulfills the interests of aesthetic life, which William specifically explains has to do with marriage's fulfillment of erotic love. In drawing out this argument, William describes a larger historical framework through which we must identify other components of rational agency that are not obvious at the initial romantic phase, but facilitate this process and have become hallmarks of ethical life. For example, the various duties and obligations to family and friends, and our active participation within religious and civic institutions. Given this direction of the argument, the marriage letter does fit into a certain metaphysical tradition of clarifying, as it were, erotic love's real nature, such as the symposium, I would argue. And the underlying rationale behind this tradition is that if A truly is interested in erotic love, he should ultimately be interested in the ethical life. My purposes in this paper are not to assess the particular deductive moves in William's argument per se. Rather, my interest is just kind of focused on how William's account of marriage addresses boredom. At first glance, there are two strategies William could take to address A's concerns. Either show that marriage is not boring, or explain why boredom is not the sort of problem A takes it to be. The quickest way to persuade A that he ought to marry is to show how marriage is sufficiently interesting for someone of his abilities. And this has some plausibility in the text. For example, Williams' constant claim that erotic love comprises the substance of marriage seems to mean that marriage could be sufficiently interesting insofar as erotic love is interesting. Yet this idea only takes us so far. Our basic common sense intuitions tell us there is more to the marriage relationship than the mere fact our spouse excites our aesthetic interest. Part of the reason we marry is our desire for our spouse as a life partner. We desire and respect our spouse as a person whose values and interests we seek to align ours with. This is what William means by a yearning for a home, I think. And this set of principles structures the relationship as a whole. Even if William does not exactly articulate the case for marriage around respect for persons, he clearly scorns marriages designed to satisfy various self-interests and social obligations, and he specifically condemns so-called aesthetic marriages, wherein the details of the relationship are arranged in order to stimulate our interest. Spouses in these relationships hide their true feelings and intentions from one another, but this secrecy belies a more insidious problem, which is that the spouses seem to regard each other as objects to manipulate just to make life more fun for themselves. Principles of honesty and mutual respect between persons as life partners should forbid them from ever using each other as mere means for aesthetic fulfillment. Manipulating a partner in this way betrays an egregious difference between the intentions each person brings to the relationship. And then, of course, there's Johannes the Seducer, an extreme version. Given the possibility of such an extreme, the point should be taken that William's position affirms the need to base ethical marriages on honesty, transparency, and respect for the other person, principles that extend beyond the partner's ability to relieve boredom. Therefore, to make the case for marriage because it is interesting enough to keep pace with aesthetic life seems to neglect several crucial aspects intrinsic to marriage in the first place. One conclusion to draw at this point, then, is that marriage is fundamentally distinct from aesthetic relationships in prioritizing respect for persons over the interesting. Furthermore, the idea that marriage is interesting such that it responds to asexual desire to avoid boredom, I think, is to concede a basic point regarding the aesthetic view of life, that the existential problems it describes must be confronted on the terms the aesthetic sets forth. So much of the tone of William's letters indicates the contrary, that he views aesthetic life as a critical misunderstanding of a human being's needs. The worry is that marriages premised upon respect might be too boring to convince A that he ought to get married. The fact that marriage invokes certain values that transcend the mere aesthetic recalls another obvious intuition, or really just a platitude about marriage, that there are more important things in life than what one had formerly believed. For example, valuing a long-term monogamous or parental relationship where one hadn't before. Admittedly, this sounds vague, but getting A to appreciate how there is more to life than the concerns that stir up boredom is necessary for thinking ourselves beyond boredom as a problem. In brief, it requires getting comfortable with the idea that erotic love must be situated within a greater temporal framework. The impetus for William's discussion goes back to first love, in which we experience first love pulling us in a direction without our need to assert intentional control. This again is first love's internal telos. But from this fact, William infers the need for a temporal framework to fully satisfy its longing. The first step in the argument is to show how the marriage institution itself presupposes a temporal framework. Throughout the letter, William describes marriage's basis within various civic and cultural institutions, the Danish state church being the most important. In fact, it does not seem to occur to him that marriage exists apart from this association. Now, one of the defining characteristics of marriage qua religious institution is its historical nature. The institutional dogmatic basis for marriage recounts the history of the human race from its inception to the present. To enter into marriage is to accept this story of humanity. and several points follow. For one, the history of the institution is a claim about empirical identity. An institution's character depends on the concrete details of its actual history. As with any human institution, marriage as we know it is a product of historical events, which furthermore has an effect on the individual's identity. His second letter to A, William's second letter to A, elaborates much further on the ethical need for a history and the empirical basis for our personal identities. But suffice it to say here that once we understand ourselves as married individuals, we necessarily identify with the particular practices and traditions that comprise marriage as an historical institution. Hopefully that point is obvious. Marriage brings a set of practical, formal commitments and obligations that were not official before. We self-consciously take these up in our life from now on during this marriage ceremony or whatever, however you got married. In sum, William's reasoning culminates with the idea that to base one's identity within a marriage is also to recognize how it makes a normative practical claim upon itself. Marriage is not a passive state of identification or relationship. To be married presumes a commitment by the spouses to maintain the practices and traditions that have identified it throughout history. So William's overall argument for marriage essentially rests on the idea that this appreciation for one's historical nature has a transformative effect on the individual. Through marriage, we become self-conscious historical agents. To commit oneself to a spouse in marriage requires the commitment to a deeper temporal historical understanding of oneself and to accept the institutional obligations within that understanding. And I just want to emphasize that most importantly, these obligations take place within time. In more conventional, everyday terms, these obligations translate into the various mundane obligations between spouses that comprise the particular marriage. At this point, A's reaction is predictable. The fact that everyday mundane obligations characterize marriage inevitably induces anxiety over boredom. A's response is actually instructive for William's argument, so let me walk through it. William, and the rest of us for that matter, I think would all recognize the same. In most relationships, if not all, the headiness of first love all but fades out, and the initial romance loses its immediate grip on us over time. With this loss, the relationship consequently becomes something abstract, something which the partners must assume intentional efforts towards sustaining. They have to work at it. First love no longer pulls them along as it had once before. Moreover, this work involves a similar routine day after day, which only increases if children are present. As a result, and if we are honest with ourselves, married life oftentimes takes on a tedious, humdrum quality. And at this point, our commitment to the relationship is guided by a commitment to the idea of marriage itself. We push through these problems because we care about the marriage. This sort of justification just seems alien to the first love experience. From this abstract perspective, then, certain unsettling questions can well arise. Was it a mistake to get married? Am I wasting valuable time with this person, with this family? This is the problem of boredom, cast in a more particular language. And yet, William tells us we need not regard these mundane, tedious details of marriage in a humdrum way. We can actually demonstrate how they actually demonstrate how boredom is not the problem A thinks it is. Towards the end of the first letter, William cryptically observes, here's a long passage. Like a true victor, the married man has not killed time, but has rescued and preserved it in eternity. The married man who does this is truly living poetically. He solves the great riddle, to live in eternity and yet to hear the cabinet clock strike in such a way that its striking does not shorten but lengthens his eternity. End quote. This passage is fascinating insofar as it suggests a seeming picture of boredom. I think that passage continues by describing somebody as actually in hell. And yet, the married man suffers no such problem at all. And I really need to emphasize this point. William self-consciously describes a lot of this later part of his letter as something A would find boring. Think back to the rotation of crops, where A had sought to cultivate the accidental nature of how life events unfold, telling us that, quote, arbitrariness is the whole secret, end quote. Arbitrariness presumes no deeper historical context whatsoever. The specific details of A's life and relationships are simply discrete moments that don't add up to any greater whole. On the other hand, the married man understands how the specific moments of his relationship fit within a greater historical context. As a matter of fact, they matter to the institution as a whole. That's a very important point, the fact that these small details matter. It's possibly the most important point. It's in this way that we see how marriage engenders the more to life quality and perspective that was missing in pre-ethical relationships. The mundane aspects structure the married man's identity as a married individual. In marriage, he acknowledges the existential necessity of this temporal historical perspective of which A is incapable. And there's one final dimension to marriage that William offers in this passage, which is that marriage is a poetic achievement. As he states, the married man is truly living poetically. Whether intentional or not, this remark clearly reminds us of A's advice from rotation of crops, that one overcomes boredom through the creative manipulation of the objects of experience to make them more interesting and enticing. For A, the possibilities of aesthetic creation are presumably endless, but for William, the solution to boredom is a synthesis that affirms the concrete, mundane details of life as having larger historical significance. The married man is grounded by relationships and experiences that A would dismiss, but it's almost as if A cannot see them. I'll develop this in a moment. And ultimately, this is what it means to say that marriage has aesthetic validity, that there's poetry and creation within marriage as well. So how good is William's argument? In the end, I hope my analysis has shown that boredom is the primary problem for A. And if William is to succeed in convincing him to marry, William must get A to appreciate how the historical perspective on erotic love gives us a reason to get married. Given this statement of the issues, then there are basically two related concluding questions I have, which touch on issues raised in the introduction. How convincing is William's argument from A's perspective? And how convincing is it from ours, the general reader? To the first, the short answer is that William seems to recognize himself that A is likely unconvinced. The latter probably finds this account of marriage just as boring as it was first described in Rotation of Crops. At another later passage in the marriage letter, William preempts this response from A, challenging him to explain how he knows that married couples are bored with their lives. In other words, how does A know that they aren't happy and content? What strikes me about this rebuke is William's acknowledgement that a marriage might appear boring from the outside, even though the partners don't experience it that way from the inside. Outer is not the inner. In my view, this observation gestures at a practical problem that underlies many of Kierkegaard's works. The fact that we cannot sufficiently understand or imagine what it's like to exist at a different sphere or stage of life before we are able to get there somehow. Elsewhere in his letter, William offers up another nugget in this vein, remarking that, quote, there are things of which one can never have any substantial conception if one has not experienced them. And among these is being a father, end quote. Again, the emphasis is on finding oneself at a particular place in life first and only giving justification for it afterwards. As an interpretive matter, I think this is the approach we ought to take to any number of the transitions Kierkegaard describes between different existence stages. In my view, it's fully possible we can't sufficiently know our reasons for choosing a new way of life over another. We just kind of find ourselves there. Therefore, one of the technical problems with the marriage letter is that William doesn't really explain how this value transformation takes place or could take place. Is it somehow possible to provide an explanation for how one attains the historical perspective beforehand? Or do we take the plunge or leap by marrying and hope that this perspective grows within us afterwards? I have to say that the latter is kind of my experience, for what it's worth. There's a lot that I can agree with in William's letter, but thinking back to my pre-married state, it's difficult to conceive what its deductive route to my current appreciation for marriage would have been beforehand. I also think there's a circularity problem here. William is telling us that the ultimate justification for marriage is the historical perspective. But if one were to question why she should care about the historical perspective, William's response is that she is led to it because of the interest in erotic love. Why can't she or A just continue with the program from crop rotation? Having to answer this sort of question may be the reason why William composes a second letter to his aesthete friend. Given some of these uncertainties, I am dubious that the text can help us justify ethical life as rationally preferable to the aesthetic. If it's not clear how to provide a rational justification that explains the transition to the ethical, then how can we really affirm the rational justification of the ethical itself? There are two other concerns about William's account that are worth bringing attention to, but I want to wrap things up quickly, and so I'll mostly just be spitballing, throwing questions out to consider. A formidable problem has to be that William's religious worldview does the heavy lifting at establishing the historical perspective. Marriage is a sacramental relationship within organized religious dogma. So organized religion provides the grand historical perspective on the human race as a whole, as well as the individual's life within it. And just also want to point out that in William's other marriage letter, in Stages on Life Way, he just totally doubles down on the religious aspect. So there's a bit of question begging at this point as well. Must we be appropriately religious if we want to have any hope in marriage? An exclusively dogmatic justification creates obvious problems for secular leaders of either or then. Are there any secular alternatives that can effectively sustain the historical perspective? My last observation has to do with one final gut level intuition about marriage, which is that most of us married folk do think boredom is a problem for our relationship. And I've checked on this with several of my married friends to make sure. Other people should let me know if I'm wrong. Of course, we want excitement and stimulation that retains the headiness of first love for as long as possible. And just to wrap this up quickly, in marriage, we love and commit to one particular person. And I hope that the love and commitment originate from a sense that there is something special about him or her that makes a historical perspective extraneous. If so, perhaps this fact should justify the value of the interest in marriage.